When you think of economic booms, you probably think of Japan and the United States, or maybe more recently, India and China. However, Vietnam has actually been a bit of a dark horse in the economic world for decades now. I mean, the nation's GDP has grown 60 times over in just the last 30 years, while standards of living climb across the country and a thriving manufacturing sector finally takes off. But what's actually driving this economic explosion? And where is Vietnam headed next? Well, to answer that, we need a quick history lesson. From the 1940s to the 1970s, Vietnam endured a nearly constant state of warfare. First against the invading Japan, then against the retributive colonial France. Then, later in 1955, after a very brief break, they fought against themselves in a 20-year-long civil war that devastated the country and led to countless deaths. By the time the dust had settled in 1975, communist-led Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the world. The GDP per capita at the time was just a fraction of its neighbors, and the country was being effectively bankrolled by its much richer, much more successful older brother, the Soviet Union. Recovery was agonizingly slow, as natural disasters were more than enough trouble for the farmers in the north, who were already hampered by the ineffective collectivist farming policies. In the years immediately following the war, Vietnam had hoped to copy the Soviet Union's economic strategy of rigid and centralized economic planning. However, this returned lackluster results, and 10 years after the fighting had stopped, the country was hardly any better off. Standards of living were still low, while debt and inflation were higher than ever. Finally, in 1986, the ruling Communist Party of Vietnam finally agreed that maybe a little less communist in their Vietnam and a little more free market access would finally turn things around. This process was known as the Doi Moi, which vaguely translates to the Renovation. The Vietnamese Congress, led by the more reform-minded Nguyen Van Linh, helpfully organized this renovation into 5 broad points. Firstly, a concerted effort to increase the production of food, consumer goods, and exportable items. Then, the government of Vietnam would continue the efforts to control small merchants and capitalists, while also at the same time acknowledging the reality of supporting a mixed economy. They would regenerate the planned bureaucracy while making the economic management system more efficient by decentralizing authority and making room for more independent decision-making. Then they would clarify the powers and jurisdiction of the Council of Ministers and reorganize the state management apparatus to make it more efficient. And lastly, they were committed to improve party organizational capabilities, leadership, and cadre training. So to simplify these 5 points, the government planned to add a little more capitalism to their communism and to overhaul their government to make sure it actually functioned like a government is supposed to. Now, if you think this whole communism with a little bit of capitalism thing is starting to sound familiar, it's probably because the government of Vietnam practically copied China's homework, taking heavy inspiration from Deng Xiaoping's economic and administrative reforms of 1978. These Chinese reforms applied very similar administrative overhauls and market-oriented ideas. Now back to Vietnam, these reforms quickly shifted their economic stagnation into rapidly accelerating growth. In just the first 4-year period, Vietnam's annual GDP growth averaged about 4.4%, beating out Western nations like Australia. Now during this period, Vietnam would finally overcome the famines that had racked the country for decades now. And in a case of very fortunate irony, foodstuffs are now among their most common exports, with the country sitting very high on global leaderboards of sugarcane, coffee, and of course rice exports. It was also during this time that Vietnam would discover oil in its own backyard, which would of course become the country's leading export, or at the very least it was until the manufacturing sector caught up in the following decades. Vietnam's success continued through the 90s as GDP per capita quadrupled, poverty rates declined, and foreign investors poured more than $18 billion into the country, spurring small businesses and major industrial projects alike. However, the 90s were not without strife for Vietnam. The start of the decade was marked by the fall of the Soviet Union, which was, yes, one of the most important events in human history, but also more importantly for Vietnam, they remained a major provider of economic and material aid up until the very end. Furthermore, the biggest communist country in the world had just fallen in what seemed to be overnight, if you ignore all the foreshadowing. This, of course, was terrifying for a fellow communist nation like Vietnam. But it wasn't until 1997 that Vietnam was truly shook with the Asian financial crisis. This crisis occurred after the Thai currency, the baht, totally collapsed, leading to a devastating domino effect that would fall across the country. Thailand, of course, but also South Korea and Indonesia were absolutely devastated by the crisis, suffering from crippling bankruptcies, resignations, and rioting. Vietnam stepped away very shaken but for the most part unharmed. However, the crisis helped the ruling party realize that maybe hurtling your country through stratospheric levels of growth was maybe not the best idea. So from here they shifted to a policy more focused on macroeconomic stability and stable growth. But this didn't mean the fun was over for Vietnam. The 21st century would continue to provide more fruitful successes for Vietnam. For example, they signed a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. This normalized trade relations and to some extent buried the hatchet of the Vietnam War. Vietnam continued this extroverted lifestyle, joining the World Trade Organization in 2007, after more than a decade of vying for membership. Vietnam would also see a massive rise in tourists, who valued the country's affordability and natural beauty. During this period, Vietnam would also benefit massively from what is known as the China Plus One strategy, as major manufacturers shifted production from China to other, even cheaper nations, such as their literal neighbor, Vietnam. In recent years, the Vietnamese manufacturing sector has continued to grow, and a budding automotive industry has even begun to sprout. For example, domestic EV company VinFast saw massive success across Vietnam, and has even moved into international markets. However, despite what appears to be victory after victory, the people of Vietnam still suffer from a myriad of problems. Most pressing among these is the seemingly widespread poverty in rural and mountainous Vietnam, where some regions suffer from poverty rates as high as 18%. Widespread corruption also racks the public and private sector, and although some significant arrests have been made in recent years, Vietnam received a score of 40 out of 100 on the Corruption Perception Index, placing the country alongside nations like Bulgaria, Cuba, and China. But ultimately, Vietnam's story is still genuinely remarkable. The nation emerged from decades of warfare, struggling as one of the poorest countries in the world. Then, in a single generation, they shifted to a manufacturing hub and became one of the fastest growing countries the world has ever seen. But the future still remains uncertain for not just Vietnam, but the whole world, as globalization as a concept is tested every single day. The question is, how will Vietnam navigate a rapidly shifting global order while also tackling its own homegrown problems? Vietnam's future rests on that question. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you have anything to say or if we missed anything, be sure to comment down below. This has been Envy.